Castlevania's Combat Cross, also known as the Vampire Killer and in Japanese the Battle Cross, has served the Belmont family for generations. At first glance, you might say the Combat Cross is just fantasy nonsense with its seemingly magical extendable chain, but with a little history and research, we may find that it takes very real inspiration from weaponry from our past and present. This episode, we are going to dig into the design of the Combat Cross and see if it would ever be a feasible weapon in real life. Let's start first with the obvious inspiration, which is well known in the Castlevania universe, the whip. The Combat Cross is a natural evolution in the game series of how the whip would be modernized in a world of vampires, but in real life, the standard leather whip is the end of that evolutionary cycle. The metal and chain link style whips never became popular or practical, and were used more only as experimental torture devices. The flail originated in Germany and Central Europe in the late Middle Ages and was created to be swung not in a barbaric manner, but in a tactical way that would be able to hit behind enemies' shields. This was a difficult tactic to master, but in the hands of a skilled warrior, it often would confuse and intimidate the average sword and board soldier. Don't be swayed by modern media's depiction of the flail by being a commonplace weapon alongside swords and axes, however. Very little information is known about the flail's use in the Middle Ages because of its general sparse use in battle and high learning curve for young men just trying not to get their limbs lopped off during a time of constant war. The Combat Cross benefits from its tactical use of mid-range combat, as does the flail, and here we start to learn how valuable it is to be able to strike at a safe distance with an instantly retrievable projectile weapon. The chain sickle, or kusarigama, is a Japanese chain-style weapon with a sickle on one end and a weighted ball on the other. We now see the start of a more versatile chain weapon with the momentum-based blunt attacks of a flail mixed with a close-range slashing edge similar to that of a small scythe. Whereas the flail would be used in tandem with a shield, the kusarigama requires both hands in order to properly wield this weapon. While the constant swinging ball acts as your defense mechanism, able to parry and disarm enemies, if a foe does manage to break your defense and force close combat, you must rely on your skills with the sickle. A very risk and reward weapon that takes special finesse and patience to use properly. The Combat Cross's wide swinging horizontal combat style shares much with the kusarigama. The meteor hammer is a Chinese weapon that closely resembles the Combat Cross's momentum-based combat style, and we start to see how an extendable and retractable chain weapon could be feasible. Unlike the Combat Cross, however, this action is not achieved by some mechanism in the weapon, but by the human being themselves acting as a leverage device. The meteor hammer can be used in a swinging flail manner, a whip-like throwing action, a overhead slam, and can also even be used to parry opponents' weapons from their hands or snare them all together. History has proven that an adaptable extending chain weapon can be quite useful and more versatile than your standard weapons in some situations. The massive learning curve to become even adept at this weapon is its largest fault, and you will find only the most dedicated of masters able to wield it properly. But this obviously comes at a cost, and one loss of momentum in battle could lead to the wielder's demise. If only this style of weapon could be adapted into a more practical, easy-to-use weapon that could extend and retract on its own. Let's get to the most unbelievable part of this weapon. The retractable chain mechanism that seems impossible to implement into a one-handed weapon such as the Combat Cross, and you would be mostly right. This extendable chain technology is actually more readily available and commonplace than you might realize, and you may even have something similar just sitting around your house that could be the foundation of implementation of a Combat Cross in real life. Yes, the Combat Cross's hilt is unrealistically small to actually house the amount of chain for the weapon, let alone a mechanism to extend and retract the weapon at will, but the answer to how this could function is not too far off. If above the hilt this weapon was large enough to house the retractable chain mechanism plus the chain, we might actually be able to have a nearly fully functional combat cross. Would it be a one-handed weapon? Well, probably not. It would take a much more barbaric two-handed swing to wield, which would technically work, but the great levels of finesse we see Gabriel Belmont use when wielding the combat cross would not be achievable. The conclusion today is that yes, the Combat Cross could feasibly be a usable weapon in combat, but would be a much more bulky and unwieldy weapon in real life, and it'll lose a lot of that spectacle that makes the weapon so fascinating in the Castlevania series. I hope today that your appreciation of fantasy weapons has somehow deepened, and maybe the next time you see a crazy video game weapon you might stop and think, hey, would that really work in real life? Hey, thanks for sticking around to the end. I'm pretty open to suggestions for the next In Real Life episode coming out next month. So if you want to leave some submissions here in the comments of a fantasy weapon from gaming that you would like to see where inspiration stems from, just go ahead and leave them below. I'll use the most interesting one for an episode, so leave some good ones for me, please. This has been Deadite from Boomstick Gaming, and thanks for participating in real life.